Welcome, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, to the podcast. I'm very honored to be talking today with Scott DeJong. Scott, very happy to have you on the podcast with us and talking with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to being here and just chatting about game design a little bit.
Let's talk about your areas of expertise. Like with your projects that you've worked on so far, what are the areas that you have the most experience in? What are you working on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I had to define myself in terms of like areas of game design, it would fall into educational or what some people refer to as serious games. And I like to draw a difference there because you have those educational games that are like your 2 + 2 = 4, and then you get to do something, and you have your educational games that are like through play, you kind of interact with critical issues or concepts. And so I'm much more in the latter end where I try to create games that talk about critical issues. The personal games that I've worked on look a lot of like at digital issues and how we can present those issues in analog spaces. So I kind of look at simulation a little bit in how I make games to simulate digital issues to try to make them more accessible to people through play.
Very interesting. So like, what would be some examples of some stuff that you worked on, like trying to access to access that essence of simulation?
Yeah, I mean, so the first major project that would kind of do this was my master's work here. I did it at Concordia University in Montreal, and the project was looking at privacy generally when I first started. And so the idea was to look at digital privacy, but how can I make this accessible to people in a format that's both engaging but critically kind of aware of what's going on? And so I used an escape room for that. And so for my master's, I built about a 30-minute escape room game that looked at boiling down from privacy issues of echo chambers, issues of filter bubbles, and issues of like digital personalization. So how your newsfeed is specific to you as a user. And I did all of that in an escape room rather than an online game. And so people would come in and there was kind of some performed characters that helped enact this kind of overseeing role. And then there's a series of puzzles that are all like allegorical or analogies of these kind of digital infrastructures that exist. So that's probably like the largest one. And then currently I'm working on taking kind of that war game genre of play where war games try to simulate specific historical events. Instead of focusing on historical war, I'm focusing on like the disinformation war. And so I'm trying to present kind of online information flows and how fake news might spread from a network such as 4chan to a Facebook comment group. And so I'm creating like a board game style process to show that.
I love both of these things. Okay, I want to hear about both so much more here. So what drew you to doing an escape room to discuss privacy? But like, what was the main pull there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting story in the sense that I came to Montreal to do my master's, and I came thinking I was going to be some kind of like academic or scholar that I'd sit in a room, I'd write essays, read a bunch of things, and then kind of throw it all out there. Um, and I started working on it, and I didn't like what I was doing. I was kind of looking at like privacy policies for video games, and while it's kind of interesting, I was kind of like a privacy policy is kind of boring. And for me, I have a background in education, like that's what I did before I started my master's, and I wanted to kind of tie my interests around user privacy with kind of teaching tools because I realized that there's not a lot of accessible formats. And so what I did is I kind of sat down and I was like, well, how can we make this more accessible? Like, what are some of the barriers there? And one of the barriers that I came across was that a lot of the tools to talk about like digital literacy or how to teach people about these issues are online. And I was like, well, that's great, but what if you don't even know how to navigate online spaces, but like maybe someone set up a Facebook account for you, and so you're like using Facebook, but you don't really understand the final issues of your privacy loss on those platforms. And so I was like, well, an analog game might be a really great way to do that. And so I thought of different genres, and the escape room genre I really enjoy because it's very like specified in what has to happen. Like you go into a space and you have to get out of the space. And then everything that within that space can kind of be simulated in some capacity. And so what I wanted to do then was I chose that genre because I felt that it would best and kind of encapsulate like a user within a network and how they can kind of have every bit of their actions scrutinized and watched and interacted with. So I kind of went from an academic project to a creative project where I was able to kind of move away from writing an essay to then instead kind of writing a game, I guess is a way to phrase that, to try to wrestle with similar issues of like, how do people kind of understand the content they're seeing and why are people engaging with that content?
I suppose I'm curious, how many people were you thinking of having in the room at once?
Yeah, I mean, so it was a four-player game when I designed it. And then I myself, because I was a student and it was an individual project, kind of played as a performer in the room. So I played actually two different characters in the game. One that was only understood through external communication, such as notes under the door or messages sent to a phone in the room. And then the other one was like a character that was part of kind of the fantasy of the game. But it was meant to be a 2 to 4 player game. I love games that invite collaboration. I think it's really important to either work with someone or like kind of be forced to work with and against someone to a shared goal, especially when you're trying to teach. I guess teach is the word. Teach a concept to people because it helps them kind of share the knowledge that they have with the knowledge that someone else has. And so I find that 4 is a good number, especially in something like an escape room, because anything more than that, it can get overwhelming. Like you have a lot of different voices and opinions, and anything kind of under 2, it's kind of an individual thing, and you feel kind of awkward, especially if you want people to like role play, which I kind of wanted a little bit of in the game. So I felt that having someone there with you kind of eases people into that role play. Because if I'm just by myself, I might feel very awkward to role play. But if I have a friend with me who's like also willing to like kind of joke around and the role play is not super serious, I might be more willing to kind of make a fake name for myself or play into this role that I'm in some facility or whatever it might be.
Hmm. So, kind of jumping off of like the aspect of the role play there. So there's definitely like the methodology of like wanting this to be like educational and built in. I'm curious like I suppose you could say like almost like the in-game lore of the situation was. But like what exactly were like the people like quote unquote like stepping into like was it like some sort of like I'm unsure, like the vastness of the internet. Was it like some secret cabal of like shadowy people? Like,
Yeah, no, for sure. So actually, so the name of the game, which I now have grown to absolutely hate, was Reactile was the name I was going for, and now I just hate the name because it reminds me of Eractile, and that's just not what I was going for at all. But I didn't catch it at the time, so it's just awful. But that was what I had. That's what I went for. So I'm not going to change that now. But the idea was actually like it was very much a game of analogy. So it wasn't that you were entering into like the digital space, that the Reactile was like a game company. The idea was that you were welcome to be playtesters for a game company and you were coming in to try out some of their new game products. And so when players enter the room, there's a bunch of like little mini games set up on a table that this company is trying to produce and they want to get feedback from. And kind of the general story of the game was that slowly through play, the players would realize that this company was actually changing their reviews. So they were manipulating what kind of responses the players were providing, or they were trying to get the players to give a positive review of the company, even if the company itself was quite toxic and problematic. And so it was using kind of methods of personalization to try to influence player behavior or perspective of a company. Obviously, players become very apparent of it, and so what I did is I had this performed role, and the performed role I called this character Craig because I wanted to think of something very generic. And so no offenses to any Craigs that might be listening, your name's wonderful. Uh, but this character named Craig was kind of meant to represent the company, and so players had to kind of watch as their space became personalized towards them. So Craig would try to talk to them about their interests, and then like the room would start playing music based off what they liked, or I'd bring in food based off what we talked about, or I would start wearing different colors of clothing based off kind of the preferences they showed and how they engaged in the space. But because Craig was this corporate employee, even if players started to realize that the company itself was quite problematic, they kind of had this weird relationship of like, I don't want Craig to know what I'm doing, and so it kind of creates this facade that they're trying to wrestle with of like, I'm hiding my intentions from this Craig person, but I'm watching as what Craig does influences the space around me. Which was meant to kind of show this personalization, how eventually the space becomes almost an echo chamber of what they told Craig about. Because by the end of the game, there's music blaring based off their favorite artist that they said they suggested. There's like a tray of food out there for them to enjoy. Craig's wearing a very exaggerated, colorful outfit based off the outfit choices and preferences that came up in conversations at the start of the game. That it kind of throughout play they watch as their early choices are reenacted to them uh, by the game's end.
I love the concept of Craig, just this megomaniacal individual who's just like, oh yes, please let me make you feel as comfortable as possible, and just like this. I suppose I'm curious, like where the inspiration to that arc came from. Like what was it that you were just like, okay, we can tie, like this is like the in-game story, and this is like the elements that we want to pull in to kind of for this educational aspect. Like where did this like the story of the villain Craig arise from? Like what was your inspiration for that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this idea of a villain in a game is so generic out there that I mean, I'm working on another project where we've been talking about like, what does this villain mean? What's the stereotype that we're trying to avoid? And I kind of had that similar issue of like, initially it was going to just be a completely player-led game. But because I wanted to get so many concepts across, and the goal of the project was not to create a competitive game, but to create an educational or a serious game, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to be able to help guide players as they encountered materials. So Craig became this pseudo character, but like facilitator. So as people were playing the game, Craig would point out something maniacally, being like, "Oh, I've noticed this specific part of like your engagement. Like, tell me about what you're doing there." And because players are trying to hide what they're doing from Craig, they have to come up with excuses on the spot for like why they were trying to break into the lock in the corner of the room. And what this does is it creates moments for these players to kind of reflect on their practices and then try to obfuscate that or hide that from Craig. And so I felt that that role was a really nice way to kind of help facilitate their engagement with pieces of the game, beyond just kind of me being like, so like, tell me what you think about this product, where I could kind of have them try to role play out of it. And some players were not nearly as successful as others, and I did punish them for that when I was playing as Greg. So I actually took away like parts of like the game room, which in an escape room can be like terrifying for a player because like what if that was a clue. Um, so Craig kind of helped encapsulate this goal of facilitation alongside play that I really wanted for an educational game, because when you're making an escape room, typically you're just setting a time limit, you're putting a bunch of locks and codes in a room, and you're kind of sending players in with a loose narrative and saying go for it. But in an educational setting, the goal is to have them kind of wrestle with the concepts of the game. And so I didn't have a time limit, but Craig helped provide pressure as well to players by kind of coming in and out and being like, so we're going to have to end up the play test soon, or like, do you need more time, before you can give me your review? So the players could feel the tension but still have not like that kind of pressure to like beat the clock, whereas instead they were just trying to outsmart this Craig character.
Hmm. Oh, that's man, that sounds awful for the players, just having this immense pressure just built and not having any concept of like how much time exists, but also not having any time exist at all for like how long they actually need.
But
Uh,
he plays off very friendly. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I playing Craig was like trying to be like overly kind, which then becomes cynical very quickly, which was quite fun. And the players also had a phone that they found from like an ex-employee that was kind of like a helpline. As if anyone has played an escape room before, you know that you can ask for hints. Players were never gonna ask Craig for hints because Craig is this like cynical character. Whereas with the phone, they could kind of ask this ex-employee like for help on things. So there was kind of ways for them to not be totally stressed out by Greg if they were really struggling.
so what was the response to the game for all of the players who went through it? Like what was the response that you received the most from everybody?
Yeah, I mean, so I ran a total of, I think, 15 different playtests for the game. And so this was a master's research project. And so, like I mentioned before, it wasn't like the most publicly accessible. I mean, I did open up the public to come access it, but I don't have the best promotion as a master's student at the time. So I only had a few hands, so I had 15 playtests, which was still a very nice amount. The feedback that I got was quite positive for the most part. And mind you, this was one of the first independent games that I'd ever constructed. So for me, it was a little bit like, how good was this going to be? And the feedback ranged from talking about kind of like the academic rigor of the project, which was what some of it was for on my master's end, but also just talking about the play experience. And so a lot of players really enjoyed this kind of performance in escape rooms. I don't know if other people who are listening have gone to escape rooms before, but I've never actually been to one with actors. I've been to like haunted houses that kind of have an escape room vibe, but typically there's no actors there. And there was a lot of love for like having kind of this performed role within the escape room. And I want to just clarify that like while Craig was a performed character, the players themselves, the level of performance expected was really just to lie decently about why they were doing things in the room and maybe change their name if they wanted to. Like there wasn't a high level of like performance required. Um, but I think a lot of players really appreciated that, and there was a really interesting dialogue of like some groups of players wanted to role play more. They like wanted to like really take on their own character, and others were like, I really didn't want to role play whatsoever. And I think that's just the nature of like player types. Um, but in general, the feedback for the game was quite positive. A lot of people talked about how they felt that it was quite engaging. And the most important part from an educational standpoint, if people are thinking about educational game design, was the debrief at the end, where Craig got to sit down with the players and kind of take off the Craig mask. So I got to sit down with players, and we just talked kind of about what happened and kind of re-walk through that experience. And when we did that, a lot of players kind of revisited those points of tension with Craig and kind of recognized where like the learning material was kind of in that place. And I'm using learning material loosely because it was really more like where the analogy existed. So where that example of personalization rested within the game there.
Oh man, I personally just love that. Like I do often find that escape rooms lend themselves so easily to like the theatrical side of things, yet people don't utilize that side of it, which is very disappointing. But I'm very glad to hear that everyone loved your portrayal of this true villainous figure. Oh, you mentioned a character like what is it? There was the Craig aspect. You mentioned that there were two different characters that you would lend yourself to being on and off, and one of them was slipping notes under the door.
Yeah, so this was this ex-employee character. I actually never named them. I just used initials to kind of let the players write their own story there if they wanted to. And so this ex-employee was kind of meant to reflect escape rooms typically offering players hints. And so early on in the game, players kind of find a note that unravels them to find a phone. And this phone is connected to this ex-employee who's like willing to help them because this ex-employee had already noticed these kind of practices that the company was doing, but had been unable to kind of get them out there due to NDAs and being fired and all those other things, where the players are kind of helping that employee in their task. And that's kind of what creates the first initial tension because when the game starts, you're just brought into the room and you're told, can you play test these games for us and then leave a review? And then during those play tests, once they're left alone, players kind of uncover that this ex employee was treated poorly, about these kind of like review manipulation. And then they kind of find a message line with this ex employee. And some players used it a lot. So, like, when I wasn't in the room as Craig, I was like waiting on a phone on the outside, ready to text back because I had to do this all on my own, which was great and a really awesome learning experience. Uh, However, there was like if they text that guy while I'm in the room, I can't respond right away. But luckily, that never actually came up because I think the roleplay element kind of pushed them away from doing that. But this character on the phone was sometimes used a lot. Like players would message me a lot, kind of either asking for tips or some of them actually scrutinized me. They thought that like I was like another like lying character, and so like they would like send me a bunch of messages trying to see like how legit this ex-employee was. And I think that's my favorite part of kind of running games in general is kind of seeing how players take the story that you as a designer put into it and then like either really jump into it or like change what you expect. So getting players to like test me as an ex-employee about the company based off facts in the room, or some of them just sent me distracting text messages hoping that I would like get thrown off or something. Was like really funny to see. Uh, and kind of really enjoyable. But it was also there for those players who really struggle to kind of connect a puzzle to a solution, and so they can kind of drop hints of like maybe where to look or what piece is missing from that as well.
Uh, but one, I'm curious, like, what was like from like that whole experience working on that was it on the escape room in total? Uh, like, what was your like either like most interesting experience with a player or like your favorite aspect of like when you see like was it like specific puzzles that you were just like I don't know if I made this too difficult and then the players figured it out it's like yeah, yes, or is it more uh like the players like doing like the questioning over the cell phone? Because I know personally like whenever I would run like any sort of game, I always love when players will think of something that I didn't think of to begin with and just go, okay, now I've got to answer this question. Let's figure this out.
Exactly. I mean, it's like a very like D&D or Pathfinder thing of like you set up a campaign and your players do something completely different and you just like are on the fly like, okay, my notes go out the window. What are we doing today? And personally, I agree. That's like my most enjoyable part of both designing a game and watching people play it. For the puzzles, I mean, it's always nice to see them kind of solve it or kind of get difficulties and then solve it. But for like the goals of that game, I didn't want the puzzles to be insanely hard. Like this isn't the most intense escape room people would ever play. It's actually quite a simple escape room, especially if you've played a lot of escape rooms. Because the goal it wasn't to stump players, it was to challenge them enough that they felt like there was some resistance to like getting through the room, but then they were able to solve everything. And obviously, you playtest all the puzzles before you even run the game. Like I would just set up like a puzzle individually in a space and was like, "Come try this puzzle out. Tell me if you can solve it." Um, but yeah, like seeing those moments of play that just kind of arise, and you see just new expression or new ideas from players are always the most enjoyable. So for this specific game, I think my favorite moment was I had a team of players. There was two guys in the room, and they were about 75% through the game, and they had been doing great, like they had been crushing it so far. And the game was set up in a like an ex office space at Concordia. They let me use the space for a few weeks, and I set up the game in there. And so I had to use the room I was given with, and one of the things I didn't notice when I set up the room was that there was paint on the ceiling, and the paint happened to be glow in the dark paint. And one of the things the players find is a black light as they're going through the game. And so these players were shining the black light around, and then they saw this paint like light up under the UV lights on the black light on the ceiling, and they thought that it was like astronomy. Like they were trying to like do like star charts to figure out a clue. And I watched them for like 5 minutes because I had a camera on in the room, like mapping out like the paint spots on the ceiling to try to like find like a star pattern to then create like a number clue. And I'm like, on one hand I'm very proud of them, like they're doing a lot of extra work that doesn't need to be done. On the other hand, this doesn't connect at all to anything in the room, and so it had to do one of those like go into the space and be like, what's wrong with our ceiling, like what are you, and try to like push them away from that. But it was, I really love seeing that, and like in a future game I would love to find ways to incorporate kind of those moments into the solutions. Unfortunately, for an escape room, everything's kind of hard determined how it functions. Like this key opens this box, so it's harder to do that on the fly. But I think a future game would be really interesting to kind of create those allow those moments to occur and kind of reward them in a game like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of, was it taking a step away from the escape room and heading to the disinformation war game? I'm curious, kind of in a similar sense for the privacy game is, I suppose I'm curious to like the similar extent with the escape room for like your inspiration and what exactly like drew you towards that and making it the escape room. I find like the like a disinformation war game to be so interesting, but also like very poignant to what exactly uh, we all kind of collectively are facing, like just with like how like Google algorithms and Facebook algorithms just work, just to be able to give you the information that you're looking for. I suppose I'm curious what what is the like focal point and the inspiration that was really inspired you into that direction for that kind of educational game.
Yeah, I mean, so the first piece there that I should just note is that the game is still in development. I'm still prototyping it. And but the piece that brought me into it is over the past year I've been working with a professor at Concordia looking at like political simulation games. And we've been looking at some of those like really old like simulation games from like the 1960s to today and kind of like mapping how they're functioning. And that's been really interesting and fascinating. But for myself, kind of building from that escape room, I still had a lot of interest in kind of digital environments and digital media flows. And I started kind of looking at simulation games, which then brings you into this world of war games. And from there, I was like, well, I mean, you hear all the time this idea of a disinformation war. It's like a concept that people would drop in like news articles, and like especially with COVID hitting, there was like a lot of talk, especially at the start of like the disinformation war to get COVID information out there, because there was a lot of different opinions and perspectives flying around, especially in the early months of the pandemic. That I was like, this idea of a disinformation war is really cool. And so I kind of wanted to wrestle with it a little bit more and kind of figure out what to do. And so as I was working on that simulation project, I started thinking, well, like, what if we can simulate this kind of war? And now I think that the definition of a disinformation war is actually misleading. The game is not necessarily like, yes, it's a war game if we want to drop it into a genre, but it's not like it's a battle. Like when we're fighting disinformation, it's not like we have our front lines against it and we're setting up like artillery. It's really more an ecological view is what some scholars are calling it, and so that's what I've been trying to approach with the game. So for people listening, if you've ever played a very famous game, especially now known as Pandemic, that has like a much more of an ecological style of play where like you see this virus spreading through the world, and as players you're taking on a role to try to stop it. It's kind of a similar inspiration for what I've taken to creating this game, where I'm having disinformation specifically, spread through digital media networks, almost like a virus, but it's player controlled. Whereas in Pandemic, it's you kind of just draw cards and kind of put tokens where the cards are drawn. This is much more player driven in how it's done. And it's actually been really good so far, at least in the playtest, of simulating how disinformation goes. The biggest challenge right now has been making sure that it's fun to play. Because I created a simulation and I was like, well, the simulation's pretty good, but like this is boring. Like no one wants to play this. And so I'm kind of went back to the drawing board and I'm in like phase two now of like, okay, let's keep that simulation there, but how do we create a bit more of an engaging game space for players?
No, when you said it was an ecological focus on the gameplay, the first thing that came to mind was Pandemic. So I love the comparison there. Uh, I suppose like when initially I was thinking like war game aspect, I couldn't help but what I think it was Matthew Broderick, that 1980s movie War Games, where I was curious if it's like was it because I could also see it in the aspect of like what is it, like in most war games nobody wins because in the end you just destroy yourselves. Uh, but I also really love the concept of like making it like that like pandemic-esque game, but it's the player choices that trigger where things happen and how fast things spread. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean the win condition for the game has actually been one of the challenges. When I first made the simulation, I sat down with players. I was like, I'm going to tell you right now, I don't know how you win. We're going to figure it out together. By the end of the game, we'll decide who's won, and we'll determine what's the system. That's now become kind of I view the win condition for this game now as almost a territorial control win condition. So whichever team, if you're on the defenders of fake news or disinformation, you're trying to stop the spread, and then if you're trying to create the spread, it's kind of whoever has the most networks controlled by the end of the game is kind of the winner in this current prototype. But it is weird to kind of be like, how do you win? I mean, because like my one friend was like, for me, spreading fake news, I think I've won if I convert Reddit to believe in lizard people as God. Like, and I'm like, I mean, you're not wrong, but there's like 4 other networks that you didn't get to, and so there's kind of like a like, how do we win condition this? As a war game, for anyone familiar with the war game genre, there's typically in the classic war game a blue team and a red team. One is typically the aggressor, and one is the defender, or uh, one is the team that you're trying to simulate for and who's against. In this, there's a blue and a red team, but they're kind of semi-collaborative teams. So it's a 4-player game right now. There's 2 different characters, but they're both on the blue team side, and then there's 2 different characters, and they're both on the red team side. So right now the game is fact checkers and digital literacy educators versus conspiracy theorists and meme factories. Um, and so you kind of are working with a player, like in the sense that you're both on the same team, but what you can do is completely different. So fact checkers focus on removing content, flagging content, getting rid of it, whereas digital literacy educators focus on kind of teaching users within networks to defend themselves against fake news. So to be critically aware of what they're reading. Whereas on the red team side, if you are a conspiracy theorist, you're just spending your time spinning a bunch of different conspiracy theories, so hoping that some of them catch on and then start to spread, and then you can help propagate that further. Whereas meme factories kind of look for where conspiracy theory has caught on and start injecting memes into the network to help spread it further or gain more support there. And so there's kind of this like collaboration between the roles in the sense that they have shared goals, either of spreading or stopping the spread, but how they do that is very different.
Hmm. So I am very curious, kind of like following down that aspect. What so far while doing your play tests have been like the most interesting mechanics that you've seen, whether that's like establishing something with like players, like to be like, for example, like more RP focused, or like or perhaps like mechanics focused in like how exactly you can like the best way for like collaborative play, or like I suppose I'm curious like what so far has been the most interesting aspect in development uh, for playtesting.
Yeah, I mean, so the initial core of the project was to show information flows, so to show how information gets from one network to another network. And so initially, I was like, "Oh, this is going to be easy. You just add a token here, you move things around." And instead, it's kind of been, at least for me, the most interesting mechanic has been this addition now of different types of conspiracy theorists. So initially, in the first playtest, it was all just conspiracy theories was a blanket general term, and you just had a bunch of tokens and they all represented one or different ones, but they weren't like unique in any way. And now I've looked into having player cards that are like different suits, but instead of like those suits are conspiracy theorists. So there's like a yellow suit that are like the crazy lizard people, and then there's like a purple suit that's like anti-vax. And kind of from there, I'm still kind of trying to have more fun with the conspiracy theorists. I don't know if I'm gonna go with like anti-vax and lizard people. I might go ridiculous and just make up a bunch. Because to me, that's not really that doesn't matter for the goal of the game. Like those can be anything. I was even at one point debating just letting the players write their own. And so one of the play tests, a friend had a conspiracy theorist that something about like key lime pies taking over the world or something was like conspiracy theorist that they wrote up, which is kind of fun, and then players can do their own thing. But from a mechanical standpoint, I've liked kind of this addition of suits because it allows players to kind of choose a specific kind of conspiracy theory that they want to spread and then really jump in and engage on that one, whereas before it didn't have that kind of narrative focus. It was just like, I spread here, I put a token here, and now it's a lot more like, nah, the lizard people control Reddit and we have them on lockdown. Everyone on Reddit believes in this theory now, and we're moving to Facebook next. It's like there's a much more of a narrative there, and I think just changing like that aspect of the game has made so much more of a narrative piece for the players.
Hmm. So I suppose what is it? Then I am curious, like I suppose I'm curious what your hope for the end game for this game will be. Like kind of like the debrief section for when you're doing the escape room. I suppose I'm curious what you think the most likely outcome you'll be experiencing with your players, like what you think the uh, like response will be, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, so the current objective is for the game to kind of be playable. I'm looking at like high school and up. I don't have a specific age range because I feel like if you take the time with most kids, they can learn a game. They just some games require more time or less. Um, but the goal in terms of the debrief is to kind of sit down after the game and kind of just look at the board state and kind of talk about like what has actually happened here. And so now that I have these like more specific conspiracy theories that are being spread, you can kind of talk about how this theory started in Reddit, but then moved over into Facebook, and how those kind of were either supported or not. And I'm actually naming, so the board, if we're thinking like a pandemic board, it's a bunch of different cities. In this case, it's a bunch of different nodes, and I'm trying to name all of them. I'm still in the process of naming all of them, but like an example might be like the Joe Rogan podcast could be like a node that players could like engage with because he has a little bit of a community of an audience that engages with certain networks more than others. Um, and so there's kind of a story that players can actually witness being told on the board. And so I imagine kind of sitting down with players after, unfortunately, I haven't got to the stage yet, so this is all imaginative right now. Sitting down with players after and kind of being like, okay, so this is the narrative. So how did we understand how information kind of traveled? What was accurate about the simulation and what was like not accurate? And always pointing out kind of like what was the game side of it and what is more the reality side of it. But then also from there, kind of talking about the roles of the players. So for the playtest so far, I mean, I'm biased, but I would say that the conspiracy theorists are the most enjoyable because you get to kind of have a little bit of fun, talking about your lizard people or whatever it is taking over. Whereas like a fact checker, you're spending the entire game kind of just trying to like stop the bleeding almost. Like you're just kind of rushing around trying to remove these like conspiracy theories from taking hold. And so even in those play tests, and we talked about kind of those different roles, people playing the fact checkers were like, it's a lot more of a frustrating role to play. And so when we talk about like why you're frustrated playing that role, we can talk about kind of what that means for our own digital spaces. So fact checkers like today really do struggle with there's so much content to fact check that they can't do it all. And so like what are other things we can do to help that? And so there's kind of a piece where at the end of a game, if a player's like, I was frustrated playing this role, I'm like, I'm sorry you were frustrated, but that's great. Let's talk about it. And then let's try to talk about like you as a player now playing this, watching how it spreads. What do you think are things that we can start doing in our digital networks to try to prevent these spreads on our end, and try to talk about solutions as kind of my hopeful goal for this in the long term future.
Yeah, it's no, it's I absolutely agree in thinking that like just because there's like an annoyed or negative reaction to something doesn't mean that it's a bad reaction uh to games sometimes, because sometimes you just like, yeah, it opens up that discussion so well. um and so kind of going to like more of a, like, I suppose, like larger view over the past two games that we've discussed today. um I'm curious what has like drawn you into going into education about like digital, what is it, like digital aspects of our world, and kind of looking at like disinformation, to like looking at privacy and like opinion, and then like kind of like the mingling of those two things. I suppose I'm just curious where like what exactly pulled you closer to that, to go into those aspects for an educational.
Yeah, I mean, so I should preface all of this with I'm still a very new game designer. Game design is something that is relatively new to me. I didn't design my first game until 3 years ago, and since then it's kind of just been a something that I've tried to spend more time doing. And so knowing that, when I kind of decided that I wanted to, in my undergrad when I was being a teacher or studying to be a teacher, there was kind of a point where I started taking some classes that talked a little bit more about these digital issues. I took a course that talked about online privacy, and it was like a really great interest for me. I was like, oh, this is fascinating. I then like went and like changed all of my privacy policies on my end. Like I made my user preferences much more secure and all those things. But then since then I've had some interest there, and I mean I still am doing academic work kind of in these areas. I am a PhD student here at Concordia University right now, so I am kind of still studying some of these things. But games have been a really great way for me as both a visual and a kinesthetic learner to also just try to think through and wrestle with the concepts that I'm kind of studying. Um, but this desire for education has kind of been a thing that it's always been part of me, where I've always wanted to kind of help people understand these concepts. And so I think games are a fantastic resource to kind of talk about issues or themes or cultural challenges, because games can be reflective of culture. And we can look at tons of games to talk about that. And so for me, a game acts as both kind of a experimental table where I can sit down and start like thinking through, well, like what does this visually look like to me? Like what does an internet ecosystem actually look like if I try to map it out? And that is still a challenge I'm working with, but it's been really rewarding to try to think about like what does Facebook look like on a board? Like what does that even mean? And so for me, games have kind of been a way to bridge my interests around kind of these digital issues that kind of arose when I was doing an undergrad, and my interest in kind of making research accessible, by allowing me to kind of create while I'm researching and then produce those as kind of hopefully accessible models. And so, like that first game we talked about, I wrote a master's thesis on it, which is publicly accessible online. The game that I'm making right now, I hope to have it all be publicly accessible for people to play should they want to. And I hope it's engaging enough that it's not just another boring educational game. But there's a big part for me of trying to connect my interest in these like cultural digital issues with kind of accessible formats, and I think games is the format that I think is best suited for that.
Hmm. I I can do nothing more than agree with you there. Uh, yeah, no, that was just that was so succinct, so perfect. Yeah, no, that perfectly answers the question. Okay. Uh, well, in which case, I think that wraps us up here for today. Thank you so much, Scott, for being on here and answering all of my mattering questions. Where can people find you?
Yeah, of course. I have a blog where I post sometimes more regularly than others, kind of about my research processes, which is stratagem.blog. But you can also just follow me on Twitter at swbdeyoung, and I tweet a few times a day or once, sometimes a week, typically about my research, but sometimes just about living in a pandemic, which we all are doing right now. So stay strong, everyone.
Rally together, everyone. Well, perfect. Thank you so much, Scott. This has been wonderful.
Thanks for having
And
me.
yeah, okay.